Hi, and welcome to Unit 1, where we are going to walk through time and look at all of the different attitudes and movements that we've had historically with respect to individuals with disabilities. So the first thing I want to point out, and I don't want to be a talking head in this lecture, you will have this PowerPoint available for you to download and go through as you want. So I'm going to only highlight a few key facts within each page and just kind of talk to you about what I think is the most relevant detail that you need to know. This first one, I really want to talk about how disability is defined according to a culture's values, beliefs, and customs and needs. So if an individual lives in a community where manual labor is very much a requirement of living, then intellectual disability really isn't a disability in that area, whereas a physical disability might be more of a problem because it impacts that culture's ability to live. So really keeping in mind that throughout history, we have defined disabilities differently according to different cultures, different values, different families. And so it's really important that we keep that in mind, that disability is a construct that truly is defined by culture. And one thing we know about history and the history of disabilities is that attitudes have started it all. It's really sometimes frightening to look at the history and see how individuals were treated in the past, but at the same time, it's necessary to see how far we've come and really look at where we're going to go in the future. So we're going to go way back to the ancient era and really talking about nomadic tribes. And basically, if you could not contribute, again, we're going back to that value and culture of a definition of someone's differences. If you couldn't contribute, then you really weren't deemed to be someone that was important or even allowed to be living in that environment. So back then, if you had a disability and you weren't able to contribute, you either were killed or you were moved to another location and kind of just ostracized and basically not a part of that. There was no membership in that community. The Greeks and the ancient era is a really interesting time. As you recall, if you think about Greeks, the Greek mythology and all of that, what we know about that is a lot of stories, a lot of meaning behind those stories, weather, and a lot of those phenomenons that were really a mystery. The Greeks really addressed them through stories and mythology to try to explain the unexplainable. So things like disabilities were also challenging. And in that respect, Greeks still sought for more rational reasons to try to look for why things are certain ways. Back then, epilepsy was considered a disturbance of the mind. If you were deaf, basically you were determined to be uneducable, because communication was essential at that time. And people who had intellectual disabilities were often called, quote, idiots. A lot of people don't realize that. It's really interesting. In today's world, we all have this like, don't say R, the R word, and I truly believe that's terrible. We should never say that. But there's also a lot of other words that are definitely damaging as well. An idiot is one of them. Hippocrates was a different person, because basically what he did was started to say that epilepsy was not a disturbance of the mind, but it was actually a brain disorder. And he tried to look for more medical reasons beyond those mythological explanations that were being attributed to disabilities. This is a quote that he said: "It is thus with regard to the disease called sacred. It appears to me to be no wise more divine or more sacred than other diseases, but has a natural cause when it originates, like other affections. Men regard this nature and cause as divine from ignorance and wonder, because it is not at all like other diseases." So epilepsy was something that was visual, and it was very concerning and different to individuals back then. We talked about the word idiot. One thing that is kind of funny is basically the Greek word idiot referred to someone who wasn't a public official, because if you were a public official, then you were higher regard, you had professional knowledge. And I just think it's really interesting that today's world, people who are public officials tend to be called the word idiot. So we've kind of flipped it on that. I'm not going to go any further than that, but I just think that's something to go, right? Early Christianity really brought on a time of sympathy and pity. So, there was this, this poor person with a disability. And you're going to learn a lot more about that pity when you read the Shapiro book. But that's where some of that started, as well as looking at disability as someone who's impure, or a parent of a child with a disability was sometimes labeled as a sinner. And basically, they determined that God had punished this individual for their sins by giving them a child with a disability. So again, this sort of abstract concept of disability, people trying to make sense of it through their own cultural beliefs and values. The Middle Ages moves on to basically indifference, neglect, and fear. So individuals with disabilities were often court jesters, and they were utilized for entertainment. They were considered to be humorous to them, and they didn't know how to address individuals with disabilities. So they would either outright ignore them, or they would use them in some capacity as entertainment. There were asylums. The first asylum was founded in 787 AD for abandoned infants, and other disabilities were started to be brought into these institutions. So again, individuals who were not able to live within the community were either killed or basically sent off to another part of the society or in an institution. A lot of people don't know this, but again, going back to that word idiot, this is a picture that was basically, this existed, this took place back in the Renaissance era. Entertainment was unfortunately often involved a cage in the middle of the town square with individuals with disabilities inside of it. And those were referred to as the, quote, idiot cages. And the intent of that was to keep them all together, individuals with disabilities together, because there was fear, again, with this unknown, as well as entertainment. Ship of Fools is actually often referred to, and there's a lot of paintings, a lot of pictures referred to as a Ship of Fools, and it basically depicts a story of putting all individuals with disabilities or people who were deemed to be not community members, etc. They were all put on this ship and kind of shipped off to go to nowhere land, away from civilization. Again, it's documented in the history, and it was for also deviant populations as well. So you're welcome to read more about that if you want in the future. Again, going back to the Middle Ages, there was a lot of fear, and then a lot of also attraction to supernaturalism. So sometimes people who had disabilities were persecuted, and a lot of times there was a lot of physical abuse, as well as just outright killing people because there was a belief that there was evil. People with disabilities were among the poorest citizens. We still see a lot of that in today. Interestingly, a lot of the research shows that after 21, when an individual's disability exits our school system, we know that those individuals tend to be the hardest to employ, as well as live independently, because our communities really don't have the necessary supports that they should. We're getting there, but we're not there yet. Renaissance started to look at some medical care and education. Was started to recognize that some were educable versus uneducable, and that took place. There was also disability communities that were starting to be formed, and also institutions. We had a lot of witch hunting that took place, as you're probably familiar with the Salem witch trials and things like that. And a lot of people don't realize that a lot of people who were determined or labeled as witches were actually those who had disabilities. And people with epilepsy with seizures were really regarded as being possessed and evil in some way. Again, this is all fear and a lack of education. There were some laws that have been passed over the years to try to help individuals with disabilities. There was also some time during World War II when people with disabilities were started to be regarded as educable and that they could usually maybe be in a specialized program. Went back to the Salem witch trials I talked about earlier, where there were 19, they were at the time called feeble-minded. There was a lot of really bad labels we used for people with disabilities: feeble-minded, uneducable, all of those kinds of words. So there was a lot of persecution for those so-called witches. In Pennsylvania, we had the first hospital created for mental illness, and at the time it was called mental retardation. We now have Rhodes' Law that refers to it as intellectual disabilities. And it's not to say it was good. They weren't being ostracized or killed or persecuted, but they were being they were allowed to live. They were sent to institutions, but unfortunately that way of life was very, very poor. There was a lot of chaining of individuals to the wall, and again, a source of entertainment. 1773, Virginia established the first hospital solely for the treatment of, quote, idiots, lunatics, and other people of unsound mind. So really not so PC with our language back then. This was one of the hardest lectures for me, by the way. In 1793, we had a famous doctor from a Paris asylum who basically started talking about how it was inhumane and it was immoral to have individuals with disabilities chained up and do all these terrible things to them. And so instead they replaced chaining with straitjackets. So slowly but surely moving. Still not good, but we're getting there. 17th and 18th centuries, we had more constructive and scientific individuals who started to study. And you'll notice that as we go through time, that the greater attention and treatment of individuals increased as people became educated and specialized and advocates for this kind of work. In the 1800s, there's a famous movie called The Wild Boy, and it's about Jean-Marc Itard, who had this boy who he called the wild boy, who could not communicate, who would not communicate, did not have words, whose behavior was just out of control. And he used metal letters and different ways to teach him communication that improved his behavior. And so that was a really important documented time in history when there was basically proof that education could change the behaviors of individuals with disabilities. So that was a really good thing. 1817 was when Gallaudet was founded. In 1820s, we had a lot of changes with people who were oppressed or neglected, and individuals with disabilities were extremely poor. In 1832, the Perkins School for the Blind was established. And in 1831, the first school for the, quote, severely retarded, that was the language, I'm not using that word, but that's what they called it, was opened in France. And that's when sensory training became famous. And in 1845, there was a famous person named Dorothy Dix who advocated for the separation of individuals who were incarcerated in penitentiaries and poorhouses because they had disabilities. So she led to the establishment of 32 state-run mental institutions across the U.S. And because, again, back then, if you had a disability, you were also incarcerated. And so they had people with disabilities with people who were criminals. And there was a lot of discrepancy going on there. 1848, there was a private school that was opened for students that were basically had an intellectual disability. Life for individuals with disabilities has consistently been fairly poor. There was practices in the early century called warning out or passing on, where basically they would leave individuals on the outskirts of the town and basically ostracize them from being allowed to be around their community. invisibility and abandonment took place where basically there was this immediate growth of institutions where every state started to have institutions where they took people with disabilities and just housed them in these institutions. There was professional views of people with disabilities changing, but at the same time, the belief was if you had an individual with a disability, the best place for them was to go to this institution because that's where they could live. In spite of changing views, the size and number of institutions continued to grow, partly because of depression and lack of educational services and just a lack of education in general. Unfortunately, a lot of people don't know that during the Holocaust in Germany, that a great deal of individuals who were sent to concentration camps and who were killed were individuals with disabilities. So there was a huge number of individuals with disabilities who were killed, and terrible time back then. The American frontier movement looked really a lot better. We started to move into community-based services and started to have more integrated services. Rehabilitation services was followed after World War I. Really interestingly, after World War I, perceptions of disabilities changed dramatically. And that is because they had, for the first time, seen physically able-bodied, mentally sound and aware, in other words, people who were typically developing, were joining the army. These young men were joining the army, going out, fighting for our country, and coming home with a disability. And so for the first time, community members really started to change their perception and think about disability in a different way. That's when they started growing things like the vocational rehabilitation system and trying to find more supports for individuals with disabilities. So then we keep moving forward, and in the 60s, this was when a huge changes happened. We had a lot of human service delivery options, education, community-based programs, new technology, new attitudes, new concepts. Social movements were really just pioneering the disabilities rights movements. We had civil rights movements, consumerism, self-help, demedicalization, and deinstitutionalization. So all of those movements really helped pave the way for what started to move into 1975. The father, Ed Roberts, was the father of the independent living movement, and he had quite an impact on that time where they went from institutions to finding more community movements. One really important thing is people with disabilities were being denied access to basic services and opportunities, and they likened the treatment of individuals with disabilities to the way that people who were African American had been treated, and looking at Rosa Parks and some of those really pivotal pioneering moments where we had that civil rights movement. And so after the civil rights movement, people with disabilities started to say, hey, what about us? We have needs too. So that's when people really started to sit up and take notice. One thing I do want to point out back here with these other movements that I didn't really talk about was during the 60s and 70s, during that Camelot era, we also had a big deinstitutionalization movement with Kennedy. When Kennedy, we had the Camelot era going on, his sister had a disability, and it was actually pretty mild, but she had a lobotomy because at the time they would do lobotomies and things like that to try to, again, fix this disability. And she became more severe, and she lived in an institution. And when he saw what that was like, he really pushed for this deinstitutionalization movement. So we've had some really key people throughout history that have made these changes. Where do we go from here? We've changed a lot. In 1975, we had the passage of the Education for Handicapped Children's Act, now referred to as the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. We've had multiple reauthorizations through the years, and every time it gets a little bit better. 1975 was 42 years ago, so we're moving slowly but surely. But if you go back to where it was when we started this lecture and where we are now, I think we can all agree we've grown quite a bit. We have a lot more to go, but we've definitely grown quite a bit. I hope this was helpful to you. Again, feel free to go through this PowerPoint on your own without my talking head over here. And I will see you throughout this class. And now next step is just to go through the rest of the unit, complete the readings, and we'll be in touch soon. See you in the discussion. Bye.